Bonjour, soldats de France, et bienvenue au Type 56, l'histoire des armées chinoises et françaises. I'm Jason Clower. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army, and today, of France's army in Indochina. When the Chinese advisor's number two man, Mei Jiasheng, was on his way to the Battle of Nialo, which was going to be a big blowout for the communists, he was nearly snuffed out 3 times by French air. Any one of those strikes could have changed the course of the battle. Let's talk today about France's army in Indochina and how it was set up. To the French, it was known as the French Far Eastern Expeditionary Force. Usually in books, you'll see it by its French initials, CEFEO. On the approach march to Nialo, CMAG's number two man, Mei Jiasheng, was marching with his element through one of those rare pieces of open ground with no cover available when they got jumped by 4 French fighters. The French fighters, like everything else in the French inventory, was an American World War II hand-me-down. So these were piston-driven aircraft, so they were nice and slow, perfect for strafing, and that made for a very close call. Since there was no cover available, all that Mei Jiasheng's bodyguard could do was just throw him to the ground and then pin him down with his own body on top of him, like that was going to stop a 50 cal. They survived that, and they got into one of those nice covered trails that northern Vietnam abounded in. But then they ended up walking through a large section of the weapon that might have frightened the Vietnamese Transport Corps the most, namely time-delayed bombs. These were things that the French would drop along the trail because they despaired of finding porters there in real time and blowing them up on the spot. But they learned that if they dropped ordnance that had time fuses along the trail, then the communist porters and soldiers would have to march through these things very unnervingly, just waiting for one of them to go off like a car bomb at any time. From what I've gathered from post-war accounts, this had a very, very unnerving psychological effect. So here, the best that Mei's group could do was simply run as fast as they could through that section. Finally, at Nialo, Mei had a bunker, nice and deep, very solid, but the thing got napalmed by a direct hit. The only thing that saved Mei Jiasheng was that he happened not to be inside it. Superficially, then, it looked like the French Far Eastern Expeditionary Corps was going to be a very formidable opponent. The Air Force certainly knew its business. They'd been understudying the US Air Force since World War II, and they studied under and they were supplied by the US Air Force. They had American air advisors who shared with them the lessons of Korea, and we know, friends, from our own episodes, that the PLA was very impressed by US air power in Korea. But we're going to see today, friends, that there were lots of things, and especially pieces of equipment, that the French Far Eastern forces cadged from their American sponsors, things that worked great for the American military in the context of the entire system of American military might that turned out not to port very well to a jungle war. Now, I know you're saying, yes, of course, we know that from the Second Indochina War, known as the United States' war with Vietnam. But as we're going to see today, it was even more particular than that. One thing that we've probably learned from this course already is that pieces of equipment are items within a larger system, and that larger system is tailored to the needs and the forces of the country that made them. When another country comes along and just grabs random elements of that system, that is no guarantee that they're going to be able to put these items together in a newly tailored system that actually fits their realities. This is all very abstract, but if we think back for a moment, we'll remember that when the Chinese adopted the Type 56 small arms family out of the Soviet arsenal, they found that that arsenal was geared toward a completely different way of war practiced by the Soviets, where your rifleman was just a tiny little cog in an enormous armored regiment, at least, if not a division, if not a front. And the Soviets had designed these weapons because they anticipated them being used in a certain way within a Soviet motor rifle or armored division. And those things simply did not exist in the very different, more impoverished reality, the People's Liberation Army. Now, as we saw, the PLA succeeded in stitching those carefully chosen weapons and Soviet practices into something that looked very different from Soviet use, but worked fantastically for Chinese needs much of the time. The French army perhaps was not as well served in Indochina by what it got from the Americans and was able to glue together with the piddly little resources that they got from Paris. But I get ahead of myself. Let's go back to basics. What was the French army in Indochina? Indochina, by the way, friends, is the collective word for the former French colonial possessions of Vietnam, which then was divided into three separate regions, Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China. That Vietnamese area and Cambodia and Laos. All of that formerly had been French Indochina, and then in the mid-50s, it was sort of semi-decolonialized and turned into what now was called the French Union, with an independent Vietnamese country that was, of course, was still very much under French sponsorship and protection, and also the Kingdom of Laos, ditto for that, and Cambodia. Now, the next thing that we need to know is that, like the French Empire itself, the French army was an agglomeration of colorfully disparate elements. Let me issue a disclaimer, friends, that although I'm a big aficionado of French army history, I don't really know that much about it. So I do not speak with great expertise here, and I'm putting that out in front of you. In my experience, you really want to get this information straight from Francophones. So Francophones, oh, please come to the comments. You guys have always been great, especially when I pierce your ears by singing in French. But come to us now, French viewers, and share your knowledge in the comments. After World War II, because of France's complicated history in there, within the French armed forces, you had all kinds of different elements. You had the French Metropolitan Army, that is the army of continental France proper. And at this time, Metropolitan France also included Algeria, which was technically part of the French Republic. And then in Indochina, you had units who each had very different heritages and histories, depending on where they had been in World War II. There were some units in Indochina who had formerly been part of the Army of Africa. In Indochina, these seem mostly to have been Moroccan and Algerian tirailleurs and gourmiers and spahis. I'm sure there were some Tunisian troops there. There were also Senegalese units in the Army of Africa. I don't hear too much about them in Indochina, but they were present. Then there were units that had been part of the Free French Forces, operated under the British umbrella. They were equipped and organized in British fashion. And these included some French units, for example, that had been connected with the SAS. There were also units that formerly had been part of the Vichy army, and units that had formerly been part of the Maquis, the French resistance, and units who had always been part of what France called the colonial army, in distinction to the metropolitan or European French army. The colonial army was a very interesting thing. They were specifically imperial troops. In the 1950s, they were changed from being called l'armée coloniale to the troupes de marine, and this képi, the blue one with the anchor, this is the képi of the troupes de marine. These were always a highly multi-ethnic force in a way that's rather difficult for most of us in modern times to really grok, because we're used to nation states that have armies that are drawn principally from their own citizens. That is, we're used to mono-ethnic armies, but that's not how it worked in most of human history, and it's not how it worked in France. And we have to be careful here, because if you're not a Francophone, you probably unwittingly take all of your ideas and imaginations and assumptions about colonialism from the British Empire, which was quite a different animal from the French Empire. In every one of these colonial army units, you would have some volunteers who were citizens of France, born in European France, or at this time in Algeria, who had specifically signed up for these colonial forces, where they knew that they were going to be fighting. These people were professionals. And then you'd also have local volunteers from the indigenous Indochinese population, though not necessarily Vietnamese. There were also many Cambodians. Pedantic omphaloskeptic tangent. This time, I think the Laotians were all mostly contained in the Royal Lao Army, which also operated under French generalship, but I think to a larger extent, the Laotian soldiers were kind of segregated in their own semi-sovereign country's army. We return you now to our regular, more moderate level of pedantry. And in colonial army units, you would typically have roughly one half Frenchmen, one half Asians, but the proportions could be more like a third and 2/3. It all depended on the particular unit. And then finally, to complete the 20,000-foot picture, by this point in the 50s, there were also many units of the French Foreign Legion serving in Indochina. Contrary to popular myth, they were not all Germans. They were not all former SS troopers. Those did exist, but as author Bernard Fall points out, the Legion always took care to prevent any one ethnicity from forming more than a quarter of the Legion. And furthermore, by the 1950s, if you were a 23-year-old Legionnaire, which was the average age in Indochina then of Legionnaires, then you had been a kid back during the Nazi days. So the Legion was not exclusively or even predominantly German. There was also a big admixture of Poles and Italians and Hungarians and Spaniards and some Romanians. Pretty much every country that had gotten it in the shorts in some way during World War II would have had plenty of people populating the French Foreign Legion. The French Far Eastern Expeditionary Force was extra heterogeneous because Indochina was already on fire by the time French troops came back to reoccupy Vietnam from the Japanese. The communists had already stolen a march on them and organized quite formidable forces that the French called the Viet Minh, that in this series I'm trying to remember to call the Vietnamese People's Army, VPA, for reasons that I'll explain later in a little short methodology video. So when France came back to reoccupy Indochina, they already had fighting on their hands. They were already massively discombobulated, undermanned, underarmed. They had barely taken possession of their own country from its Nazi occupiers. And so they fed in units piecemeal back to Indochina as fast as they could. And it took a long, long time for the French to retrospectively kludge these units into something like a consistent force. And as author Peter D. Jackson mentions, they did this in a very seat of the pants, swashbuckling way that was already quite typical of French field commanders and became even more ingrained as a culture in the French Far Eastern Expeditionary Force, where even if the French were terribly undersupplied, they always looked amazing and they had terrific élan. Well, I don't need to tell you the difficulties faced by a World War II style force now trying to fight in a jungle colony. You already know this. Well, even though the French were certainly not strangers to colonial warfare in the 1950s, it took them a while to get used to fighting an army who was already quite well organized and armed along conventional lines. That was a new experience for them. They tried some different configurations, and by the time that we really enter our story, in say 1952 at the earliest, the French were trying a sort of combination of static stuff. There would be static forts along what was called the Delattre line, that was mainly intended to sort of hold a frontier around the Red River Delta, around the Hanoi area. Because remember, Hanoi was the capital of the French colonial government at this time, designed to protect Hanoi and keep open certain roads. As you can imagine, that did not always go very well. The remaining French forces were organized into what were called groupes mobiles, mobile groups. And the idea was that they were like great big nomadic hordes, units that didn't have a fixed base or garrison. They moved pretty much constantly without fixed abode. Now, the mobile groups, there was something of a misnomer because they actually weren't all that mobile, as we're going to see. They were road-bound for some very specific reasons, because of some tragic compromises that they had to make with their American equipment. But they did live out of their vehicles permanently. They might not have been able to move fast, but they were constantly out in the field trying to set up operations where they would encircle and trap Vietnamese communist forces. I mentioned that they were shaped by certain compromises that they had to make. One of the bottlenecks that the French forces faced was in junior leaders. Remember, France had been through a very bad, costly World War II, and they were missing a large part of a generation of the young men who should have been lieutenants and captains coming freshly out of the pipeline. Since all of that had been upset, they were faced with a terrible shortage of junior officers. For that matter, they had a good stock of senior NCOs, and they tried to use those as a sort of filler. But again, senior non-coms don't grow on trees. You have to spend a long time building them. And such soldiers and officers as France had, it needed mainly to keep in France to fulfill its NATO obligations. The manpower problem got even worse for them after 1952, when France suffered a terrible defeat in the Battle of Dong Quai, and the French electorate, who was already very, very pink, stopped allowing the French army to send French citizens who had been conscripted for their normal military service to Indochina. Those French conscripts had to remain in the French homeland to defend France proper. So now they were limited to using strictly French volunteers in the Indochinese forces. This has interesting knock-on effects later for French military culture that maybe we can talk about some other time, where the French army, it kind of became two separate institutions, the Metropolitan Army and then the very different colonial army, which with a much darker ethos and a more troubled past that felt misunderstood and abandoned and looked down upon by their colleagues in France proper, who were running like cool armored divisions. To some extent, to the traditional officers in France, the colonial officers looked like brutal knuckle draggers. And to the colonial officers, the officers in France looked like white linen napkin nincompoops eating canapes in their fine officers' messes, whereas they felt they, the colonial officers, were the ones who truly understood fighting and really gave a damn about the country's future welfare. So for all these reasons, the French colonial army was terribly overstretched for junior leaders. One thing that it had to do then was simply make bigger units. So, for example, in Indochina, the French infantry reorganized itself so that the squad was no longer the basic tactical unit. It was the whole platoon that moved together with two big squads and just two leaders. So this let them cut down the number of platoon leaders from six, this is a Chinese six, to just two. At the company level, they could reduce that officer staffing from 18 to 8. Now, did this help them tactically? No. I would think that in a jungle war, you want smaller, more nimble units, but that assumes that you have people to lead them. In the PLA model, they had a way of constantly refreshing that leadership pool, and they seem to have transmitted that same culture to the Vietnamese Communist forces. The French improvised as best they could, but as we're going to see, the load on senior non-coms doing the jobs of much senior officers was already crushing when they got to Dien Bien Phu. So as with many things in French Indochinese forces, it was already too late for them to start building this new junior leader corps because they were already out of runway. They would need another 5 years to start training these people. As we're going to see, that same thing is going to come true again and again and again, politically and infrastructurally and logistically about the French forces in Indochina. They're not dumb and they're undersupplied, but they know how to cope with it. But in many ways, they really needed this whole war to happen after 5 years more of concerted building and funding and training. And they simply did not have that time. So one effect of this French shortage of junior leaders and the consequent habit of building very large units is that, as we're going to see in the story, a French battalion was way bigger than a communist battalion. I mean, huge. The average French battalion was 700 men at full strength. But this was also very individual. As I've mentioned before, there were no cookie cutter regularities in the French colonial forces. There were battalions that were as quote unquote small as 650 men. I mean, that's still enormous by PLA standards. Or they could be as big as, say, the first colonial parachute battalion, which had more than 900 men. However, this does not mean that they were as well armed. This is another of those ways in which we have to kind of remind ourselves to forget what we think we know about colonial warfare. For example, you would think that French air power would be a huge strength for them, and it certainly had huge potential. As we saw at the beginning of the episode, CMAG, the Chinese Advisory Corps, almost lost its number two man on 3 separate occasions in the space of a couple weeks to French planes. And as we're going to see, by the time of Dien Bien Phu, the French Air Force was making a lot of promises to the French army based on their impressions of American air power as it had functioned in World War II and Korea. Problem was, first, There was a little bit of vodka in that American Kool-Aid concerning air power. There's a little bit of mythology remaining in the US Air Force about just how much their air power had been able to accomplish by way of interdiction of communist supply lines in Korea. As we know now, that was quite over-reported. And I think that the US Air Force knew that too, but they weren't quite saying, oh yeah, bombing of communist supply lines didn't accomplish nearly as much in Korea as we were hoping. So part of it was that the French Air Force was a little overconfident in its powers to stop communist resupply efforts because they'd been given somewhat bogus information by their American air advisors. But also, the much bigger problem was that the French Air Force could not hope to replicate even a sliver of what the American Air Force could do because they did not have the American Air Force. We won't even get right now into the pitiful number of planes that the French had and the even more pathetic number of pilots that they had available in Indochina. We'll come to that later. Let's just talk about airfields for a minute. Friends, you may have heard that Indochina is not Europe. Vietnam has rainy seasons, and in northern Vietnam especially, there were airfields that just couldn't be flown during the rainy season. One author, Philippe Gras, says during the rainy season, certain airfields in Indochina were just gigantic bogs. There were a precious few airports in French Indochina that had paved runways that could take flights and large planes at any time of year. But most of the runways in Indochina were either what Gras calls grills, which I think means perforated steel planks, or they were just beaten earth. These airports were not open year round. And even when they were open, a muddy, beaten earth airstrip could only take a plane of a certain size. So even if you had all the planes in the world, if you were this afflicted with a shortage of runways, you might not have a place to fly them and land them for much of the year. And no force on Earth was going to be able to change that until you fixed the infrastructure. Friends, now turn your mind to the finances of post-war France, which is trying to get itself back on its feet. Are they going to be sending tons of money to this unpopular colonial war that's now terribly out of fashion and is a very bad look for France? Hell no. They're keeping that money in Paris. On those rare occasions where, say, the French Indochina authorities got 20 million bucks to build a modern new airport, the thing just cratered and fell apart when the rainy season came. And one more little tidbit about unglamorous infrastructure. The maintenance was crap. That's not to say that it was low quality or unprofessional. It's just that it was still being run by French Indochina authorities on the scale proper to a sleepy, far off, unexciting colonial outpost, not a theater for a medium scale war. So there are many, many examples and anecdotes of bottlenecks in the French Air Force maintenance system, where, for example, they would have a certain kind of plane that needed its engine swapped out after every 500 hours, but maybe they would only have one place in all of Indochina where they could do this work, and they might only have a tiny handful of engines available for dozens of planes that needed them. Again, I'm sure that it's not that the French authorities in Hanoi and Paris were stupid, but this was so far from anybody's list of top priorities that I think probably the French Air Force did itself a bit of a disservice by functioning so well under straitened conditions that the higher ups just got used to them performing miracles as a matter of routine and just came to expect that they could do that indefinitely. Well, they couldn't. One last word about having to perform miracles. This brings us to French infantry armament. Just like the French military was theoretically supposed to have superior mobility in virtue of its air power, but that turned out not to be true. Also, French were supposed to have superior firepower, but their infantry ended up actually being outgunned by communist forces. How did that happen? Once again, it had to do with the fact that they needed to use hand-me-down American equipment that wasn't made for this mission, and then twister their mission profiles and themselves to fit their equipment. This started with the artillery. In French military tradition, artillery is one of the stars of the show. Ever since the time of Napoleon, who was himself an artillerist, the French artillery was one of the marvels of Europe. And once upon a time, the French colonial army used the famous French 75 millimeter. It was great, especially for colonial warfare. You could tow it with mules, you could shoot it fast, and the shells weighed just 12 to 16 pounds, depending on the type of ammo. And those could mess up unarmored targets. But those 75s had not been up to the job in World War II, and now, post-war, the French were armed with American artillery, starring the famous American favorite, the 105 millimeter howitzer, which was ideal for an all-American force. Sure, the 105 was heavy and you needed a truck to tow it around, but that's why God issued every American a truck and also a lot of 50 cal ammo. So that was no problem for Americans. But in French colonial service, where one of the routes coloniales, the colonial quote unquote highways, would be just a 12-foot wide dirt strip surrounded by elephant grass on either side, full of who knows how many enemy submachine guns? Well, that was not a world where 5,000-pound howitzers towed by vulnerable soft-skinned trucks were going to dominate the region. Since the infantry couldn't just carry a 105 howitzer on its back, the infantry was made very light and foot mobile so that it could go out, say, and recon the flanks of these roads that the trucks and the artillery were going to travel down. To accomplish that foot mobility, the infantry platoon, remember, which is a pretty unwieldy unit of maneuver in a jungle type setting, the infantry platoon was stripped of most every weapon heavier than, say, an automatic rifle, something like a BAR or French FM 2429. So that did lighten the platoon very nicely, and it could walk wherever it wanted, but it did mean that it couldn't safely stray outside of 105 howitzer range, which was 6 miles. So now this meant that in spite of themselves, the infantry was still limited to operating within 6 miles of a road that could take its trucks and towed artillery, which could be ambushed at any time. Again, I stress, it's not that the French were lazy or clueless. It's certainly not that they did not understand anti-guerrilla warfare, but this was a function of what they had to work with. Armament that was designed for a World War II American division that had air supremacy and an endless supply of Spam and 50 cals and Glenn Miller music. None of these luxuries were enjoyed by the French. So what this meant was that paradoxically, against whatever your reptile brain might assume, French infantry companies in Indochina had a lot less organic firepower than the VPA, which had a Chinese-type structure of 3 rifle subunits and 1 heavy weapons subunit. The French infantry just had some rifles and submachine guns. At least they had plenty of those. And maybe a couple of BARs or FM 2429s in a platoon. But that was about it. They did have a few medium mortars on call at the battalion level that were also being schlepped around in trucks, but that did not solve their problem of being road-bound, or rather tethered to this 6-mile radius of any given road. By contrast, every VPA platoon had 2 belt-fed light machine guns that traveled everywhere with them, and the VPA companies carried their mortars and recoilless guns with them wherever they went. Again, this was at least consonant with their PLA influence, if not directly taught to them by their Chinese CMAG advisors. So this meant that in practice, when a French unit encountered a VPA unit in a sudden engagement, the French were undergunned in small arms compared to the Vietnamese, and they didn't have much firepower to keep themselves alive while they called for fire support from the howitzers. They solved that in Algeria when they got big into light machine guns, as with many other lessons that they learned from Indochina. But again, they didn't crack that nut either while they were still in Vietnam, where they were just so far behind the curve that they would have needed another 5 years to really get themselves ready, get themselves organized and equipped for what was to come. It was weaknesses like this that made the French commander-in-chief think that it would be a great idea to lure the Vietnamese into a set-piece battle in Dien Bien Phu. Friends, if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. You might even visit our Patreon page or use the thanks button. This course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. You keep seeking one big air-land battle to keep red forces decisively suppressed. You're regressing when you should have been progressing, and now you drop your troops upland in the Northwest. These shoes are made for liberating, and that's just what they'll do. These liberation shoes are gonna walk to Dien Bien Phu. You're buccaneering when you should be engineering. You dig trenches that you don't revet. You're patrolling when bulldozers should be rolling. And your works are flooded in Claudine and Huguette. These shoes are made for liberating, and that's just what they'll do. One of these days, these shoes are gonna walk to Dien Bien Phu. You keep saying artillery is a surveying the high ground that you left unoccupied. I've got half a core of shiny Chinese cannon, yeah, to sweep your runway and leave you unsupplied. These shoes are made for liberating, and that's just what they'll do. These liberation shoes will overrun your French HQ.